This is Amud Bet, side B of Zevachim 16, or 16b, top of the page. Actually, it's middle of the Kal Vachomer, so start from the last line. A Tana of the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, the halacha is derived from a Kal Vachomer in the case of a blemished priest, just as, and now on top of 16b. With regard to a blemished priest who may partake of the meat offerings if he performed sacrificial rites, he has desecrated service. And with regard to an acute mourner who may not partake of the meat offerings, is it not right that if he performs sacrificial rites, he has desecrated service? The Gemara rejects the inference one cannot derive this halacha in the case of a blemished priest. And what is notable about a blemished priest is notable in that the Torah rendered animals that are sacrificed like the priests who sacrifice them, since this stringency does not exist. With regard to acute mourning, perhaps an acute mourner may continue. Where were we? What is notable about a blemished priest? The Gemara it rejects his inference. One cannot derive this halakha from the case of a blemished priest. As what is notable about a blemished priest is notable in that the Torah rendered animals that are sacrificed like the priests who sacrifice them, since this stringency does not exist. With regard to acute mourning, perhaps an acute mourner may perform sacrificial rites as well. The Gemara responds, the case of a non-priest will prove that this is no reason to reject the a fortiori inference, since there is no equivalence between priest and sacrifice in this regard, yet a non-priest desecrates the service. The Gemara rejects this as well. One cannot cite a proof from the case of a non-priest. As what is notable about the case of a non-priest? It is notable in that he has no remedy, meaning that a non-priest may never perform the sacrificial rites. By contrast, an acute mourner will eventually become permitted to perform the service. Chadash שבהן שהן מוזרים מאוד וכיללו אבל יביאונן שהן מוזר ואם אבל חילל. The Gemara responds, a blemished priest will prove that this is no reason to reject the inference, even though the priest may perform the service. If the blemish is healed, he desecrates the service as long as it remains blemished, and the inference has reverted to its starting point. Therefore, one learns the halacha from the combination of the cases of a blemished priest and a non-priest. The aspect of this case is not like the aspect of that case, and the aspect of that case is not like the aspect of this case. Their common element is that they are prohibited from performing sacrificial rites. And if they perform such rites, they have desecrated service. Therefore, I will also include an acute mourner who is prohibited from performing sacrificial rites, and conclude that if he performs sacrificial rites, he has desecrated the service. Heichan muzal. Ilem min hamikdash lo yetzeh chilo b'gofei ktibeh. The Gemara clarifies, where is an acute mourner prohibited from prohibiting sacrificial rites? As asserted in the inference, if we say that it is derived from the verse, and he shall not leave the sanctuary, he will not profane the sanctuary of his God. Leviticus 21:12. Then the above Kal Vachomer is unnecessary, since profanation itself is written in the verse. Rather, it must be that it is derived from the verse. This day have they offered their sin offering, Leviticus 10:19. And this Tana holds that the sin offering brought by Aaron was burned because Aaron and his sons were in acute mourning. The Gemara challenges The inference from the common element of the cases of a blemished priest and a non-priest can be refuted. What is notable about their common element? It is notable in that there are no circumstances in which its general prohibition was permitted. There is an exception to the prohibition against an acute mourner performing a temple service, namely the high priest who may perform the sacrificial rites while an acute mourner tameyochi. The Gemara responds, the case of an impure priest will prove that this is no reason to reject the inference, as there is an exception to the prohibition against performing the service while impure. Namely, that the prohibition against performing the temple service in a state of impurity is permitted in cases involving the public. Yet an impure priest desecrates the service. The Gemara asks what is notable about the case of an impure priest. It is notable in that he imparts impurity to others, perhaps. It is only for this reason that an impure priest desecrates the service. The Gemara responds, those other cases, meaning a blemished priest and a non-priest, will prove that this does not reject the inference, since they do not impart their status to others, and the inference has reverted to its starting point. Therefore, one can derive the halakha from the combination of the cases of an impure priest, a blemished priest, and a non-priest. The aspect of this case is not like the aspect of that case. Their common element is that they are prohibited from performing sacrificial rites, and they desecrate the service. Therefore, I will also conclude that since the acute mourner is prohibited from performing sacrificial rites, he desecrates the service. But if wow, okay. Malad Savashash Behan Shikain Lo Hutru Chalan Ela Kohen Gadol Bekorban Yachid Shem Tuma Miha Ishtarai. The Gemara asks, will let one refute this as well? What is notable about their common element? It is notable in that its general prohibition was not permitted, even in the case of a high priest performing rites for an individual's offering. By contrast, a high priest in acute mourning may perform rites even for individual offerings. The Gemara responds, the category of impurity, at least, is permitted in the case of communal offerings. Therefore, one cannot claim that an impure priest, a non-priest, and a blemished priest all share a lack of exemptions. Rabbi Sharshi Amar, Asil Kavachomer Miyoshev, Uma Yoshev Shochali Mavachi Eloinin, Shenon Echel Enorin She, Imavachi Le'en. Rabbi Sharshi says, the halacha with regard to an acute mourner is derived from aforementioned inference in the case of a sitting priest, and just with regard to sitting priests who may partake of meat offerings, is performed sacrificial rites, he has desecrated the service. Then with regard to an acute mourner who may not partake of the meat offerings, is it not right that if he performs sacrificial rites, he has desecrated the service? The Gemara rejects this. What is notable about the case of a sitting priest is notable in that one who sits is disqualified from bearing witness, as witnesses must stand when testifying. The Gemara responds, learn instead from the halakha by a sitting Torah scholar, as the court may allow a Torah scholar to sit while testifying. Ma l'shem yoshev sheken pasulei dus shem yoshev lo parich im timtzelo ma parich as yoshev machal me'alach. The Gemara challenges still one cannot derive from this as what is notable about the category of a sitting priest. It is notable in that, generally speaking, one who sits is disqualified from bearing witness, even though there are exceptions. The Gemara responds, the category of a sitting priest cannot refute the derivation. One can refute a derivation only from concrete cases, not general concepts. And even if you say it can refute the derivation, the halakha with regard to a non-priest can be derived from the case of a sitting priest and from one of those other cases, meaning a non-priest, an impure priest, or a blemished priest through their common element. Onein pasol. The Mishnah teaches that if an acute mourner collects the blood of an offering, the offering is disqualified. Rava says they taught this only with regard to individuals offering, but with regard to a communal offering, A rite performed by an acute mourner does affect acceptance. One can derive this by a fortiori inference from ritual impurity. Ma du bishul to bikola etzel kohen gadol bikola yochid etzel hediot kohen tzibur and Yehoshua to bikola etzel kohen gadol etzel kohen gadol bikola yochid ein od Yehoshua to etzel kohen hediot kohen tzibur. Just as the prohibition against performing rites in a state of ritual impurity, whose general prohibition was not permitted in the case of a high priest, performing rites for an individual's offering, as no individual offering may be sacrificed in a state of impurity, was nevertheless permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for a communal offering, as communal offerings may be sacrificed by an impure priest when necessary, then so too with regard to the prohibition against performing rites while in a period of acute mourning, whose general prohibition was permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites for an individual offering, as the high priest may perform all rites while an acute mourner. Is it not right that this prohibition was permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for a communal offering? Maskif lo ahilai lo tutanius etzil kohen gadol mikol ben yachid mikal b'chayam. Umazo mishut etzil kohen hediot b'tzibur lo etzil kohen gadol mikol ben yachid. Aninus שלא הותרה אצל כהן הדיוט בכל ציבור, אין הדין שלא תותר אצל כהן גדול בקרבן יחיד. Rava bar Ahilai objects to this. On the contrary, such an inference can be made, and perhaps one can make the following mistaken inference. The performance of rites in a state of acute mourning should not be permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites of an individual offering by a fortiori inference. And just as the prohibition against performing rites in a state of ritual impurity, whose general prohibition was permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for a communal offering, was not permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites for an individual's offering, then so too, with regard to the prohibition against performing the rites during a period of acute mourning, whose general prohibition was not permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites of a communal offering. Is it not right that this prohibition should not be permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites for an individual offering? Vetutal, for the final last stretch here. Vetutal tuma etzel kohen gadol b'korban yachid mikal v'chomer ma'aninus shelo hutar etzel kohen hediot b'korban tzibur hutar etzel kohen gadol b'korban yachid tuma shehutar etzel kohen hediot and similarly, one may claim the performance of rites in a state of ritual impurity should be permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites for an individual's offering by aforesaid inference. And just as the prohibition against performing rites in a state of acute mourning, the general prohibition was not permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for a communal offering, still was permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites for an individual offering, then so too with regard to the prohibition against performing the rites in a state of ritual impurity, whose general prohibition was permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for the communal offerings. And not right that this prohibition was permitted in the case of the high priest performing rites for an individual's offering. Lo to turn to my answer Kohen Hediot, the current seaboard, Mikal B'chomerman, he knows Shirut Rites and Kohen Gadol, Bikor Ben Yachid Rites and Kohen Hediot, Bikor Ben Tuot, Shlo Rites and Kohen Gadol, Bikor Ben Yachid, Enodin, Shlo Tutar, Bikohen Hediot, Bikor Ben Zibur. And similarly, one may claim the performance of rites in the state of ritual impurity should not be permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for a communal offering by a kal v'chomer inference, and just as the prohibition against performing rites in a state of acute mourning, whose general prohibition was permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites for an individual's offering, still was not permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for a communal offering, then so too, with regard to the prohibition against performing rites in a state of ritual impurity, whose general prohibition was not permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites for an individual offering. Is it not right that this prohibition should not be permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for a communal offering? The Gemara provides a mnemonic for recalling the above rejections of Rava bar Ahilai, and should not be permitted, acute mourning and ritual impurity, individual and individual, communal. V'nomar amen.